They whispered rumors. The world debated, but the streets of Ouagadougou already celebrated. In July 2025, unverified reports erupted across social media that Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old interim president of Burkina Faso, had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. No confirmation came from Oslo. No official list was released. But the idea alone sent shockwaves far beyond West Africa. Could a soldier who rose to power through a coup truly be recognized as a symbol of peace? Could a leader once dismissed as a warlord now be discussed in the same breath as Mandela or Malala? In Burkina Faso, the rumor felt like truth. In cafes and marketplaces, pride outweighed doubt. "He fights for us, not for himself," said one young man. And across the Sahel, leaders and citizens alike saw something bigger stirring. A conversation not just about one man, but about how peace is defined. Stay with us. This is not confirmation. This is confrontation with old narratives, with global bias, and with the meaning of sovereignty. Subscribe and do not look away. Because whether nominated or not, Ibrahim Traoré has already forced the world to reconsider. What if peace no longer wears a suit, but carries a hoe? It began with a whisper. Not in the marble corridors of Oslo, but in the digital pulse of African networks, encrypted forums, and feverish comment threads. Sometime around 27th July 2025, a rumor ignited. Ibrahim Traoré, the young firebrand leader of Burkina Faso, was being considered for the Nobel Peace Prize. There was no press conference, no official shortlist, yet the story moved like wildfire. In Revolution Square, Ouagadougou, crowds gathered, not in protest but in pride. The square that once echoed with resistance chants now filled with hopeful slogans. Flags waved, songs rose. "He speaks our language," one market woman told a local station. "He walks in the dust with us. He does not hide behind golden gates." That same day, news anchors in Paris and Washington dismissed the rumor as unverified. But in Bamako, Niamey, and Khartoum, cities tired of watching their fate debated in foreign capitals, the discussion felt different. They were not waiting for Oslo's approval. They were witnessing a shift. To understand why this moment struck such a chord, we must return to September 2022, the day Ibrahim Traoré, then a 34-year-old army captain, marched into Ouagadougou and overthrew the existing regime. It was the second coup in a single year. International observers, fatigued by instability in the Sahel, labeled it yet another episode in West Africa's crisis spiral. Burkina Faso, landlocked and long overlooked, was cast as another statistic in a region plagued by insurgencies, hunger, and foreign dependence. But for many inside the country, something shifted that day. Traoré did not take power draped in medals or speak in polished diplomacy. He stood before the people in fatigues, declaring not ambition but duty. "I am not here for power," he said. "I am here to defend this land and its children." The words echoed far beyond the square, because for years Burkina Faso had been battered, not only by extremists, but by economic dependency, political rot, and the invisible weight of post-colonial arrangements. Villages emptied, schools shuttered. Foreign troops promised protection, but attacks only grew. Aid arrived, but dignity eroded. In that context, Traoré's rise was not merely a coup. It was a rupture, a break with the script. What followed was not the descent into chaos that many had predicted. Instead, 2023 became a year of ideological consolidation. Rather than declaring himself president, Traoré adopted the title of head of transition. He refused to move into the presidential palace. He traveled, often without notice, to rural provinces, visiting displaced families, farmers, and militia volunteers. Photos showed him seated on wooden benches, surrounded by elders. Video clips circulated of him walking through maize fields with bare hands. Observers called it populist performance, but to many citizens it was proof of proximity. In a region where rulers often vanish behind barbed wire and bodyguards, this mattered. And slowly, policy followed posture. By early 2024, Burkina Faso had expelled French troops from its soil. A regional alliance, the Alliance of Sahel States, was taking shape with Mali and Niger, aiming to pool military resources and reject dependency on European forces. It was a gamble, but it was also a statement: sovereignty over strategy. Burkina Faso would not be a playground for foreign agendas. It would stand, even if alone. Then came May 2025, the turning point. Traoré unveiled a bold initiative called Farmers of Peace. It invited over 1,000 former militants to trade rifles for seeds, to swap bullets for tools. The state pardoned them, trained them, gave them land. The skeptics called it naive. But within weeks, something shifted, a 70% drop in attacks across program zones. Abandoned villages began to repopulate. Markets reopened. Children returned to school. It was not perfect, but it was tangible. And suddenly the narrative changed. Global media outlets, once dismissive, began using new words: pragmatic, innovative, unexpected. For the first time in years, Ibrahim Traoré news trended not because of conflict, but because of calm. No one could confirm a Nobel nomination, but even the rumor had reshaped perception. Because peace, it seemed, could wear dusty boots and speak in the voice of a soldier. But was this the world finally seeing Africa clearly, or simply seeing what it wanted to believe? The sun had barely risen over Ouagadougou on the morning the rumor broke, but the streets were already alive. In Revolution Square, the heart of Burkina Faso's turbulent political history, people gathered as if summoned by instinct. Some came with flags, others with nothing but their voices. They chanted not for food, nor for protest, but for recognition. For Ibrahim Traoré, for the idea, however unconfirmed, that the world had finally taken notice. In the crowd, a woman held her child and said to a passing journalist, "This is the first time I've come here not to march against something, but to stand for something." Her words, though simple, captured a sentiment that was spreading faster than newsprint, that this was not just a political moment, it was a spiritual one. In cafes and markets, radios blared. In buses and barbershops, people argued. Whether the nomination was real or rumor hardly mattered. The symbolism had already landed. For decades, Burkina Faso had lived in the shadows, known internationally more for poverty and conflict than pride. Now, even if briefly, it stood in the light. Across the Sahel, the emotional tremors spread. In Bamako, state broadcasters interrupted regular programming to run panel discussions. Was this the beginning of a Pan-African redefinition of leadership? In Niamey, young scholars gathered in university halls to debate the meaning of peace in an age of asymmetric war. Their consensus was bold, that peace was no longer something to be imported, negotiated, or bestowed. It was something to be fought for, with hands in the soil and sweat on the brow. Traoré to them was not perfect, but he was one of theirs. He was from the terrain they knew. He spoke in the rhythm of their realities. African leaders who once kept cautious distance began to comment, subtly at first, then more openly. Some issued statements praising homegrown security solutions. Others, facing similar insurgencies, saw Traoré's model as political cover for their own recalibrations. The Alliance of Sahel States, until then seen as a tactical necessity, began to look like a philosophical movement. One analyst in Bamako described it as the first time the region has authored its own vocabulary of peace. Across Francophone Africa, social media echoed with the simple phrase, "Notre modèle, notre voix," our model, our voice. But the reaction was not universally euphoric. In Paris, London, and Washington, the news triggered a different response. Editorials began appearing within hours, bearing headlines like, "From coup to canonization," or "Is Oslo rewarding military rule?" Think tanks released urgent briefings. Politicians voiced concern. One European diplomat speaking anonymously told a press pool, if the Nobel Committee recognizes this, it risks legitimizing the overthrow of democratic order. The implication was clear that peace, in the Western imagination, must come packaged in legality, not legitimacy. Some of the most biting commentary came from media institutions long invested in shaping the narrative of African governance. They warned that the elevation of Traoré could set a precedent, a dangerous signal that results could override rules. Yet, even in these critiques, there was a note of discomfort, an unspoken admission that the Burkina Faso case did not fit the usual mold. There had been no palace built in his name, no lavish coronation, no cult of personality. Only fields, only markets, only schools reopening. Even the harshest skeptics had to grapple with a paradox, that the outcomes for now were better than anyone had expected. Then, an unexpected voice entered the global stage and changed the tone. The Vatican issued a brief but potent statement. Pope Leo XIII, through his spokesperson, said he was moved by the transformation of former warriors into workers of the soil. He invoked Isaiah, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares." It was a moment of poetic symbolism, but also political weight. The world's most enduring moral institution had taken a side, not on the nomination, but on the model. For many, it tipped the scales. The emotional tide swelled. Across diasporic African communities in Europe and North America, the conversation shifted. Activists, artists, and scholars began to say aloud what had long been whispered, that Africa deserved the right to define its own heroes and its own peace. In interviews, some called Traoré's rise a rupture with dependency. Others framed it as a reclamation of dignity. In the words of one Pan-African commentator, they called it risk. We call it reality. And yet, beneath the praise, a more complicated emotion lingered, a quiet, aching regret. Why had it taken so long for the world to see leadership that looked like theirs, spoke like theirs, and rose from their conditions as credible? Why did it take violence transformed into farming for the West to finally notice? Still, the hope was louder. For the first time in a generation, a leader from the Sahel was not pleading for aid, but planting alternatives. The youth of Burkina Faso were no longer just emigrating, they were engaging. Schools were opening, not closing. And the headlines, if only for a moment, were not about death tolls, but about dignity. But even as the crowd sang and flags fluttered, one question remained unanswered, and its silence was louder than any cheer. Would the Nobel Committee listen to the soil, or only to the summit rooms of Europe? If history is written not by declarations but by daily life, then Ibrahim Traoré's legacy is already taking root, not in Oslo, but in the kitchens, classrooms, and fields of Burkina Faso. Since the launch of the Farmers of Peace initiative in May 2025, the most visible change has not been on television screens, but on dinner tables. In villages once emptied by fear, children now chase goats across courtyards. Women return to markets once shuttered by gunfire. Teachers resume lessons in classrooms where blackboards had gathered dust. The country's Ministry of Social Cohesion, in a report circulated quietly in June, noted a startling fact. In regions where the program was implemented, attacks had dropped by 70%. Not 10, not 20, 70. There were no foreign troops involved, no international monitors, just land, tools, training, and a fragile but growing trust between the state and its former enemies. What began as a security gamble quickly evolved into a social contract. The pardoned ex-combatants, many of them teenagers who had joined insurgent groups out of desperation, now plow rows instead of plotting raids. In the village of Yaga, a farmer who had fled with his family in 2022 returned to find not just his home intact, but a cooperative of former fighters tending the communal land. "I never thought I would share food with the men I once feared," he told a local journalist. But hunger changes nothing. Farming together changes everything. Beyond security, the ripple effects have begun to transform the country's political mood. Once weary of every new leader, citizens now engage. Town halls are attended. Public radio buzzes with debate, not just about insurgents or borders, but about education budgets, irrigation schemes, and road repairs. There is no illusion of perfection. Corruption has not vanished. Institutions remain fragile, but there is, for the first time in years, momentum. Traoré's own rhetoric has also shifted. Initially reserved and martial in tone, his speeches now adopt a different cadence, more reflective, more grounded. In one address to displaced families, he said, "Peace is not a gift. It is not a deal signed abroad. It is sweat. It is land. It is staying to rebuild when it would be easier to flee." That language, rooted in survival rather than ideology, resonates deeply in a country where abstractions have long been the luxury of outsiders. Economically, the initiative has delivered more than symbolic success. With over 1,000 hectares under cultivation by former combatants, local grain output in targeted regions has increased by nearly 30%. This, in turn, has reduced dependence on food imports and stabilized prices in key markets. It is too early to call it a revolution, but it is a harvest in motion. International development agencies, long accustomed to leading reconstruction efforts in the Sahel, now find themselves in a different role, that of observers. As one UN official put it anonymously, "It's strange. We're watching the community do what we've been trying to encourage for decades, and they're doing it without us." The sentiment is not resentment. It is astonishment. Burkina Faso, once the recipient of ready-made models, is now generating case studies of its own. Still, the political structure remains transitional. Technically, Traoré is not a president, but a transitional leader heading a military-backed government. There is no elected parliament. The promise of elections remains vague. Critics, both domestic and foreign, warn that even successful policies can become smokescreens for extended military rule. Civil society groups have raised concerns about press freedom and the absence of clear timelines for democratic restoration. But here lies the paradox. In a region where democracy has often meant elections without electricity, constitutions without clean water, and freedom without food, Traoré's popularity is rooted less in legality than in tangible outcomes. As one citizen put it in a radio call-in show, "I do not know if he is democratic. I only know that under him my children eat." That, perhaps, is the dilemma that now confronts both Burkina Faso and the international community. What happens when results outpace the rulebook? What happens when the most effective governance does not come dressed in electoral rituals, but in muddy boots and rolled-up sleeves? It is a question echoed not only in the Sahel, but in global debates about post-colonial sovereignty. Who decides what leadership looks like in Africa? Who sets the terms of legitimacy? And more urgently, does the world have the humility to learn from what it does not fully understand? In July 2025, an article titled "Ibrahim Traore News from Rifle to Reform" made its way through West African WhatsApp groups and diaspora forums. It did not originate from a news agency, but from a student blog in Dakar. Still, its title captured the mood of a continent. That maybe, just maybe, peace and governance could grow from the ground up, not imposed, but improvised, not idealized, but lived. Do you believe results on the ground should weigh more than political conventions? Because while fields flourish and schools reopen, another storm is gathering, not in Burkina Faso, but in how the world responds to this story. And when sovereignty speaks in the voice of the people, will the institutions of power listen or turn away? As Burkina Faso cultivated calm, the global community grappled with a different harvest, one of uncertainty, discomfort, and overdue reflection. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, diplomats spoke cautiously. Privately, some officials admitted that Ibrahim Traoré's boldness had shaken assumptions. Publicly, the AU maintained a posture of neutrality, careful not to appear too supportive of a military-led transition, yet unable to ignore the tangible improvements unfolding on the ground. ECOWAS, the West African bloc once known for swift sanctions, was unusually muted. Traoré's Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, had already withdrawn from the bloc earlier that year. In doing so, they not only rejected its political framework, they challenged its moral authority. European powers, particularly France and the EU, responded with unease. After decades of military presence in the Sahel under the guise of counterterrorism, they were now watching a self-reliant model emerge without their oversight. Analysts in Brussels warned that celebrating Burkina Faso's example might embolden other transitional regimes. The fear was not just about geopolitics, it was about precedent. How do you respond when the alternative works? In Washington, the tone was more analytical. State Department officials acknowledged privately that the security metrics in Burkina Faso were impressively improved. Yet concerns lingered about press freedom, judicial independence, and democratic timelines. A senior official summarized the dilemma. "We are watching an experiment. It may succeed, but it sits outside our playbook." That sentence, though diplomatically phrased, echoed the quiet admission of a shifting paradigm. Meanwhile, the Vatican's earlier intervention continued to ripple across policy circles. The symbolic weight of Pope Leo XIV's praise for Traoré's reconciliation through agriculture approach was difficult to dismiss. Faith-based organizations, particularly those working in post-conflict zones in Latin America and Southeast Asia, began citing Burkina Faso as a reference point. Conferences that once centered on ceasefire agreements and UN resolutions were now including panels on farming, land reform, and dignity as pillars of peace. And yet, amidst the applause and anxiety, another type of signal emerged, darker, quieter. In early August 2025, reports began to circulate online. Tentative d'assassinat, Ibrahim Traoré. The phrase spread in French-language media networks and social channels. There was no formal confirmation, no government statement, but the rumor, like the earlier Nobel buzz, took on a life of its own. It served as a grim reminder that in a region reshaping its fate, not everyone welcomed the shift. Whether real or manufactured, the whisper of an assassination attempt underscored one truth: that sovereignty, when reasserted, is rarely uncontested. Burkina Faso may be plowing new ground, but the world is watching not just the crops, it is watching for cracks. And the question lingers: would the international order embrace this African-grown peace, or quietly hope it fails? As December approaches, the anticipation thickens. On the 10th, the Nobel Committee will unveil its Peace Prize laureate. But in Ouagadougou, the decision is already bigger than a medal. Whether Ibrahim Traoré's name is read aloud or not, a different verdict is already being written, not in certificates, but in cultivated fields and reopened classrooms. Still, what lies ahead remains uncertain. One path leads to international recognition. If Traoré is honored, it would mark the first time in history that a sitting African military leader, young, transitional, unpolished, is validated by the world's most prestigious peace institution. It would be a rupture in precedent, a message that peace is not always born in suits and signatures, but in soil and sweat. It would embolden other African nations to seek sovereignty through action rather than alignment. But the risks are no less real. Critics may double down. Western allies may retreat further. Investment and diplomatic ties, already strained, could tighten. Traoré's government would face growing pressure to deliver not only security, but constitutional legitimacy. The weight of the Nobel, should it come, may become both crown and chain. And then there is the internal path. Regardless of Oslo's decision, the transition in Burkina Faso must confront its own deadlines. The people may cheer now, but patience is not infinite. Elections must be addressed. Institutions must be rebuilt. Reconciliation must go beyond farming. It must touch memory, justice, identity. Yet in all this, there is also opportunity. The alliance of Sahel states, still in its infancy, could mature into a genuine platform for regional development, not just military coordination. The Farmers of Peace model, now tested in one country, could be replicated in others. Civil society, once marginalized, could find new space in the dialogue. The diaspora, often watching from afar, may return, bringing not only capital, but connection. And if that happens, if these seeds take root, then perhaps Burkina Faso's story will not end with one man or one prize. Perhaps it will become a blueprint, not perfect, but homegrown. Because in the end, the question is not whether Ibrahim Traoré wins a medal. It is whether Africa, at long last, is allowed to define what peace looks like with its own hands, on its own land. And before Oslo speaks, the continent is already asking, will the world recognize a revolution sown in soil or turn away from its harvest? From a captain in fatigues to a figure of continental resonance, the journey of Ibrahim Traoré is more than a twist in political fortune. It is a mirror to Africa's evolving imagination. Whether officially nominated or not, his name now circulates in global forums, policy papers, and dinner table debates. Not because he promised peace, but because he planted it. In fields once emptied by fear, farmers now sow maize beside ex-combatants. In classrooms once closed by violence, children recite poetry under solar lamps. The idea that Burkina Faso, once deemed fragile, dependent, irrelevant, could inspire a redefinition of peace is itself a seismic shift. And yet it is fragile. Rumors of instability, including recent murmurs surrounding a tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré, remind us that every seed sown is shadowed by threat. But this, too, is part of the narrative. Peace in this new context is not absence of conflict. It is presence of courage, political, moral, communal. The question is no longer whether Ibrahim Traoré will make history. It is whether the world is ready to make space for a new kind of history, one that recognizes Ibrahim Traore news not as anomaly, but as blueprint. Because if leadership rooted in soil, sweat, and sovereignty can bear fruit in Burkina Faso, what stops it from blooming across the continent? What stops the Nobel Committee from seeing peace not only in treaties and protocols, but in hands calloused from farming hope? In the coming weeks, as debates swell and verdicts loom, let this moment be a reminder that Africa does not need validation to matter, but recognition when it comes can still open doors. That sovereignty, when claimed with dignity and delivered through daily life, has power greater than politics. And that perhaps, just perhaps, Ibrahim Traoré news signals not a man rising, but a continent standing. Will you stand with it? If this story resonates with your sense of justice and possibility, share it. Add your voice in the comments and subscribe to join us as we uncover more untold chapters of Black history, culture, and courage.